Good morning.
Oh, we're on.
Well,
Okay.
you go ahead, Alan.
Okay. Thanks, Sam. Well, good afternoon, I guess, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this webinar on the virtual simulated office oral exam. Uh, I we do believe we're welcoming the majority of you who have actually already examined for the virtual SU. So hopefully this will be more of a refresher. For anyone who is brand new to this process, welcome. We're going to start with the traditional land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that the lands on which we are hosting this webinar include the traditional territories of many nations. The CFPC recognizes that the many injustices experienced by the Indigenous peoples of what we now call Canada continue to affect their health and well being. The CFPC respects that Indigenous people have rich cultural and traditional practices that have been known to improve health outcomes. I invite all attendees to reflect on the territories you are calling in from as we commit ourselves to gaining knowledge, forging a new, culturally safe relationship, and contributing to reconciliation. Okay, so let's just introduce ourselves for those who do not know who we are. I guess I'll go first. My name is Alan Ng, and I am a clinician educator with the College of Family Physicians of Canada, and I am also the chief examiner for the virtual SU exam this sitting in the fall. My other job is working as a clinician teacher in the family medicine residency program at the University of Ottawa. Sam?
And hello, I'm Samantha Horvey. I am a family physician in Edmonton. I work at the U of A with the residency program, as well as I'm part of the Sioux Writers Committee. Next slide. Um, so, thank you for joining us, either live or listening to this recording. As Alan had mentioned, we do have an experienced group coming back with us to this October exam, which is wonderful. But we recognize that within that experienced group, that you are you have your own backgrounds in terms of whether or not you've done virtual SUs or in-person SUs. And so we do hope that this is useful to you. Please ask any questions you may have. We are monitoring the chat and we'll address all the questions that you have either during the webinar or afterwards. Just so as an overview of what we're talking about, if we can go to the next slide, we're just going to go through the basics of SUs and the SU format. Then we're going to talk about the preparation that needs to be done before the SU weekend, which is coming up in the middle of October. We're going to talk about the calibration day on Friday, followed by what happens on the exam days on the Saturday and Sunday. We will provide some pertinent points about the Practique virtual platform, followed by some tips regarding troubleshooting, and then we'll be open to any questions you may have. We would like to thank you for being here and being an examiner and supporting your future colleagues. Um, we know that you're all very busy, so thanks again. We just want to remind you that there is, some reimbursement for examining. There's a $750 honorarium per day of involvement, plus you can have a meal reimbursement of up to $35 a day. And also by participating in just the single exam, you get quite a few main pro credits. You get 18 for just being part of the exam. And then if you need to do the training or do a refresher of the training, you get an additional 4 credits. So that's quite a few. So now we're just going to just discuss the basics of the SU, and I'm going to pass it over to Alan for this.
And we won't spend too long on this since we're presuming that the vast majority of you have examined for the college before, but there may be a few who this is your first time. I want to just sort of mention that, as all of you know, the CFPC had to suspend the SU temporarily due to COVID in 2020 and 2021. And then we revised it again in the spring of 2022. It's a very important exam. It examines the basic construct of family medicine, which is essentially how to conduct an efficient and effective consultation between a patient and a doctor using a patient centered approach, all within a time constraint of 15 minutes. So it's not easy, but it tests basically what we do as family physicians, the central thing that we do. This is very, very high stakes for the college, for examiners, and of course, the candidates. And You may be wondering why there's a, for those who are Star Trek fans, I'm definitely more Star Trek. I think Sam is more Star Wars, but that is, if you don't know what that is, that's a tricorder, which is this fancy instrument that unfortunately has not been invented yet. And when it does become invented, perhaps the consultation will disappear. But for now, this is what we are sort of um, stuck with. This is our primary tool. We were able to run the exam successfully in 2022. We put 800 candidates through over 2 weekends, and we were able to provide a final mark for all of them. We learned quite a lot from that experience, as well as what we could improve upon as well. Okay, next slide, Brian. And again, this is just to remind you as well, what we're testing is not a virtual consultation per se, although the test itself is being done virtually. But this is just to remind you that the consultation is our central sort of tool, our primary act of family medicine. And it doesn't matter whether we are seeing patients in person, by phone, or on video. The process essentially is going to be the same, and that's what we're examining. Okay, I guess next slide. Yeah, so for those of you who have examined, which is the majority of you, you'll notice that the template, the scoring format and template is actually unchanged from when we used to do this in person. We still have two problems to identify, plus the illness experience for each of those problems. We need to identify the context and integrate that context. We need to manage the two problems and also find common ground as we're doing that. And then we're also looking at the interview process and organization. So this is very familiar, of course, to all of you, most of you, unless this is your first time examining. But as you can see, whether we do this virtually or in person, that has not changed. Okay. Next slide, Brian. All right. So one thing just to talk about, although all of you, most of you will have actually done this before, I just want to briefly go through what is going to happen before the actual weekend. You will be getting the case materials soon via share file, and Sam is going to tell you a bit more about that. We obviously need the examiners to learn the case, ideally to read that case and know it very well before Friday, which is the calibration day. And we would also ask you, if you haven't done this before, to do the learning management modules. These are asynchronous training modules. There are two of them. One is basically how to use the virtual platform Pratique, upon which the examination will be run. We're going to talk in very, very broad strokes about Pratique, but the details are going to be on that particular learning module. And then the other module, which is mandatory for brand new examiners, optional for those who did this training already in the spring of 2022, is a module on examiner bias and just some review of the basics, patient-centered approach and the principles. Everyone is welcome to do those modules or at least go through them again if they wish to as a refresher, and they may find that useful. The other thing to mention briefly is for the SUE leads and the assistant leads that are on this webinar, there is one extra module that you will do to prepare for the Friday training day. Main points about this is these modules are what we call asynchronous, so you do them on your own time. As I say, if you have not done before the module on patient-centeredness and examiner bias, that module is mandatory. Okay, so let's move on.
So I'll take this slide.
Yep.
So if you participated only in the in-person exams in the past, you may remember that you got a big envelope in the mail with your suitcase and the CD as well for the videos. But now that we're moving to a virtual exam, now we're also having a virtual delivery of all of the secure information. And the way that we need to do that is through ShareFile. Um, so the thing is you should start getting emails sometime in the next few weeks from certification assessment. And the email will look something like what is on the left there, where it says that the certification assessment has sent you files. And if you click open, it will link you to the files that they have sent you that specific day. And in one of those emails is going to be your suitcase, um, as well as the SUE videos, as well as your reimbursement form, your group names, and everything like that. So the thing is that although these emails seem a bit inconspicuous, they're actually really, really important. I would suggest that you create a folder in your email to store all of these, put a star next to the ones that are important that you need to go back to. The other thing you can do to make your life easier is you can create an account in ShareFile. Then you can access all of the files in one big group that have been sent to you, as opposed to accessing them piecemeal through these individual emails. Next slide. For those who have not yet done the training, to access them, you go through the learning management system, which is basically quite simply, you just go through the CFPC portal, log in, and at the bottom of the quick links, there's examiner training. You click on that, and then it's pretty self-explanatory going forward. And next slide. So now when it comes to training day, this is your day to meet your team, clarify any questions you have regarding the script and the marking, and practice and standardize your role. And we'll have practice candidates. So this is all going to take place on Zoom. Everyone's going to start together for training day, and it'll be at 10 o'clock Eastern time. And for those of you who are SUE leads, the teleconference will be at 6 o'clock Eastern time, just so that you can plan out your day. Next slide. Now, when it comes to exam days, which are the Saturday and Sunday, we are split into 3 different groups based on language as well as location. We have a staggered start. We're all 1 hour apart. And for each exam day, there'll be 2 sessions. There'll be a morning session and an afternoon session, and then there'll be 5 candidates in each session. So just to, again, give you some time so that you have an idea of how long you're going to be busy for. Just keep in mind that the end time might be a little bit later if we do have any technical problems and need to do any reruns of any sessions. So just, I don't expect to be off at that time on the dot. Now, since this is a virtual administration, we just need to make sure that everyone has the appropriate setup going into this exam. And I'll pass it over to Alan to talk about technical requirements.
Sure. Thanks, Sam. Yes, as soon as we hear the word virtual, yeah, there's all sorts of I guess feelings that come up about that, and whether you have the right equipment. And I think so. The main thing to understand is, firstly, a lot of this will actually be discussed again in the pratique training, but it's important to know that you need to either have a desktop or a laptop computer. So you cannot do this exam as an examiner on your phone, on an iPad or a tablet or on a Chromebook. You also need to have one of these 3 browsers, either Chrome, Safari, or Firefox installed. There also needs to be enough, I guess your computer needs to have enough storage and a decent speed. All of that is going to be tested and explained in more detail in the pratique webinar. But just to say that the most important take home from this is that you need to use a desktop or laptop. Also, the operating system needs to be either Windows 7 or newer if you're using a PC, or if you're using Apple, Sierra 10.12 or newer. So you will need to check the operating system you currently have. Otherwise, the program, certainly the virtual platform, will not work nearly as smoothly or as efficiently as it should. Okay, so let's talk a bit about exam day. Again, most of this is going to be covered in the pratique um, learning module, and I don't expect you all to remember a lot. This is really just a broad brush strokes, but when you log in, you will get now. I thought it was 1 to 2 days before, but it might not actually even be until the day of the examination. You will receive an email with your exact start time, a link to the platform, your ID, your login ID, and your password. So that won't actually, you won't get that until almost immediately before. Now, it's important to remember, and you probably won't remember this, but the credentials are going to be case sensitive, so be careful when you're typing them in. Using a copy and paste is a good way to avoid typos. We want you to log in precisely at the scheduled time which you will be instructed. If you actually try and log in earlier or try and test the link a day or so earlier, or even a couple of hours earlier, you're just going to get an error message because the exam will not actually be like what we call published until the time that is scheduled to do so. Okay. All right. So when you log in, you will find a new screen which looks like this, which is basically just a holding screen. It's a static screen, so just be patient. The examination will actually automatically start once every single examiner and candidate is logged in and ready to go. And you do not have to do anything, touch anything. When the exam starts, your screen will change automatically. It is very important. Yes, and then you'll go to this screen. Now, it is very important. Sorry, Brian, do you mind just going back one slide just to the holding screen? Thanks. That when you're in this holding screen, don't leave the room and grab a cup of coffee or anything. You have to be ready to go because that screen, just like it just did when Brian changed the slide, that screen can just switch at any time, and then all of a sudden you're going to be in the room, and your candidate is going to be there waiting to start the exam. So that's important to remember. You'll get a reminder of all of this when you do the training. Okay. So then the screen will change, and then you'll get something that looks like similar to this. It's the examiner view. So you will see your candidate, and you'll actually see yourself. Um, One thing I will mention is these pictures of yourself, the actual screen of yourself and the candidate can be maximized, and you have control over that. So you'll be able to sort of almost fill your screen if you wish, or have a bigger view of the candidate and yourself as you start the interview. So there now this slide might be a bit overwhelming. Don't worry about it. For those of you who have done this exam before, this will obviously be something you'll remember. For the purposes of this webinar, all you need to take in at this point is this is the point where you can see the candidate and the examiner. And there's a section for marking on the right. There's also some access to the SUE examination material. We're not going to go into any detail. When you start to examine candidates, there is going to be, and you will get into this, you will get into the pattern or cycle of what you do with each candidate. So there is a recurring structure. So I'll maybe pass it on to Sam to explain that. Next slide.
So for each candidate, they will have 1 minute to read their case, or just that little one sentence blurb beforehand. When they're there, you need to keep your camera covered until the timer for the SUE or the assessment time starts. So you keep it covered for that 1 minute. If they start asking you questions, don't say anything until the assessment time starts. Once the assessment time starts, which is when you actually do the SUE for those 15 minutes, then you can uncover your camera and start. And then after those 15 minutes are up, then you go into a 12-minute marking time / break time. This is the time that you cover your camera, mute your mic. The candidate will still actually be on camera. So the thing is, actually, you also act as the proctor. So the thing is if they need to go to the washroom or do anything, they'll be asking you for permission, and you can just say yes. Um, During this time, you need to mark, and also your lead may call you to review your marking. So make sure you're on mute so the candidate doesn't hear you. Um, During the assessment time, if you do run into any technical difficulties, let's say for the first 3 minutes you cannot hear the candidate or the candidate cannot hear you, the marking and the break time is also giving you that buffer time to be able to bleed into that time as well, and you take the additional 3 minutes at that point so that the candidate can have the full 15 minutes. Next slide. So the nice thing about having a virtual examination is that you do have timers. Now there are two timers to note, the one in red and then the one in blue. The timer in red is the total amount of time in that entire round. So that includes the marking time, the reading time, as well as the SUE administration time. So it totals at 28 minutes and then counts down. Then in the yellow bar or the blue square, that's a time that's available in that specific section. So the thing is that there's basically going to be it'll be a 1 minute countdown, then a 15-minute countdown, and then a 12-minute countdown. So that's for the timers. I just want to draw your attention to the photos of the people there. And sorry, the administration time is now called the assessment time. They've just decided to change that terminology. In terms of the videos there, you notice that both of those people don't have blurred backgrounds or false backgrounds. And that's because in Practique, you cannot do that. You can imagine that there's a security issue in that regard. So the thing is, make sure that your background is, not in any way distracting to the candidate. So the next thing we can talk about is marking, and I'll pass it over to Alan for this.
Okay, thanks, Sam. And as I mentioned before, the marking is exactly the way it was when we did this in person. Same marking scheme. There is a drop-down menu to select your choice of the marks. So as you know, there are basically a choice of three different ways you can categorize the candidate for each of the marking sections, either superior certificate, or non-certificate. There is going to be a comments section to report any unexpected incidents, like anything at all that comes up, conflict of interest, or candidate left the camera view, or you may have had some technical issues. You can also comment this candidate was excellent, or you felt that they were very patient centered, or perhaps they were not so. You can write any comments you want, given how much time you have. It is useful to have comments, but one thing that you do not have to do is you do not have to justify every single one of your non-certificate or superior certificate scores. So that is a change from before. Certainly in the in-person exams, you had to write down every time you wrote an NC or an SC for a candidate, you had to explain why. You do not have to do that. But any comments regarding the general performance of the candidate, any process issues are welcome and should be added. Okay. So, okay, I think next slide. So when you're ready to submit the score sheets, you'll be prompted automatically by a window that will come up, which will look a bit like this. And you will get more training on this in the Pratique learning module as well. So there's a couple of exceptions to this. One is if you're contacted by the CFPC staff to say you need to do a rerun, okay, of a candidate. So for whatever reason, there may have been a technical issue, internet went down, or something happened, and that particular candidate has to be done again. You do not submit your final marks, but stay on and you will be given further instructions. Another point is if there's either like a no-show or for some reason you cannot examine the candidate at all due to technical reasons, do not submit any scored mark sheet. And in the last exam, we had a couple of examiners submit a score sheet with just all ends because the candidate could not be assessed. But by doing that, you are essentially submitting a mark of all ends, and also that means that we may potentially lose that candidate and not realize that that candidate might need a redo. So the other thing, I guess, to complicate things a bit is we do want you to mark everyone um, as you go along. When I'm talking about submitting, I'm talking about the very end when you submit all the score sheets together. We do want you to score each candidate as you go, and to finish doing that after each candidate, although you don't submit. So sorry, I may not have made that clear, and that might have been a bit confusing. You will very unlikely to remember the details of a candidate's performance two or if you've already had to do two or three. So we do want you to score everyone, but you do not submit until the very end. Okay, so I guess the other very important thing for virtual exams is what do you do if something goes wrong and you need help? So incident management, essentially, if there's anything that you are concerned about, say, and I'm talking more so for the SUE leads and assistant leads that are on this webinar, something to do with the role portrayal or the marking, actually the candidates as well, if they're questions, sorry, the examiners, I should say, the examiner patients as well. Any questions, use the WhatsApp um, app, which everyone will be provided with a contact number for their own WhatsApp group, and to contact your SUE lead or assistant lead if there are any questions about the case. Okay. Now, if there are any problems with the process of using Pratik, like for example, you can't hear your candidate, the screen is frozen, the buttons are not working, the candidate is late or is not there, or you suspect some sort of cheating, use the chat button, which is kind of, I think it's on the bottom right hand side. Again, you will find out and you'll know exactly where this button is, certainly when you do the pratique training. All calls get triaged and then forwarded on to CFPC staff who will deal with it. Now, if internet is lost completely, obviously you can't, none of these buttons will work. You won't have access. So you need to call the toll-free number, which is listed there and will be available to you all. And that phone number will be manned all the time, and you'll be able to speak to someone directly from the CFPC who can then sort of move you forward to whoever you need to speak to. And I think that's basically all that we have to say. So thank you very much for coming. I know that there's a lot of detail there. I think most of you who have done the exam will at least have been familiar with the platform and the process. But we are now very happy to take any questions that you may have. And you can just, I guess, put those in the chat if you have any questions.
So it looks like we don't have any specific questions. Some questions that have come up in the past. What would happen if they cannot log into the platform?
Okay, so I believe if they can't log in at all, you can contact, if for examiners, you can contact your SUE leads, but you're probably best to call the 1-800 number. You can contact your SUE lead or assistant lead via WhatsApp, but if you can't log in, then you won't be able to use the chat function. So either letting your SUE leads know right away or calling the 1-800 number, and we'll be able to help you with that.
And I actually think that the chat function is still usable even if you cannot log in because it's still there on the login screen.
Oh, right.
So if you do have internet, then the best is to use the chat. Otherwise, call the 1-800 number and just let your SUE lead know. You will find that WhatsApp is actually becomes very useful during the exam. And so I actually loaded it as a like an app on my computer, so I wasn't typing on my phone all the time, but I was actually being able to type on my computer, which is just a little bit faster.
Yes,
Um,
Sam, you're right. There, I see the chat function, that little sort
yeah.
of square at the bottom right. So even if you have internet with the login page, you can actually use the chat. So that's correct.
Um, and then the second question, which has happened in the past, is what is if a candidate is a late or a no-show?
So if you're logged in and you're waiting there, you basically just sit tight, but you let us know. But you let the you can use the chat to let the can let us know, the college, that I'm in the room, but there's no candidate, or the candidate is not appearing, and we will try and figure out what the issue is with that. So you would just sit tight, but just let us know through the chat.
Um, and I think the thing is also we do have the opportunity to run an extra session or an extra station at the end, during the lunch break and things like that. So even if they for some reason couldn't get on because of issues on their end, it's not all is lost for that candidate. We can still make it work. Um, one thing that was confusing for me going through the exams in the past was the concept of a redo. Um, did you want to mention, Alan, what a redo is and when we use it and how it works?
Sure. So one thing just to clarify, if the candidate is more than 12 minutes late, um, we will have to rerun, um, a rerun. So a redo essentially is if, and this did happen a few times in the spring exam. If the exam starts and then all of a sudden the screen freezes for some reason, and more than say a minute or so, it is a bit of a judgment. The screen might freeze for 5 seconds, or even less. It may not actually significantly affect the flow of the interview, but if there's the screen freezes or goes blank, or you lose connection, then those are potential reasons why that soon needs to be abandoned and redone. Now, if that's the case, that decision will be made sort of fairly quickly, almost on the spot, and then the examiner who is involved with that um, candidate may be asked, okay, you will need to redo this at the end when we're done the circuit of 5 examiners. So that's very important that that examiner knows, and also knows not to sign off or disappear, because they're going to have to just redo that SU at the end. So essentially, as this exam proceeds, as you can imagine, the situations will be very fluid, and we'll be making a lot of these decisions, fairly quickly. But judging from our experience in the spring, we actually were able to examine every single candidate um, at the end. We had to do a few redos, but we were able to organize it. So that's what a redo. That's what a redo is.
We have an excellent question just about audio. Um, do we still need to check the candidate's audio if we're the first examiner of the half day, which is actually something that we started doing in the spring? Alan, do you know?
I think yes. Now you may, with the very first examiner, sorry, very first candidate, as you're waiting, um, you may potentially hear a proctor checking the identification of the candidate, and if you can hear that, then it's very likely that there's no problem with the audio. But I think that it will become apparent. I don't know if there has to be a formal "Can you hear me?" or not. I think it'll be apparent within the first few seconds. Um, you may say, "Oh, um, as the patient, I would wait for the candidate to start. Now, if after say 5 or 10 seconds the candidate does the same thing, you can say something very simple like "You may begin," and hopefully the candidate will hear you. Obviously, if the candidate doesn't hear you, then there's a problem, and then that needs to be reported. My suggestion is you just wait, and then when the image comes up and the candidate sees the examiner, the candidate should just be able to start. And if they don't, you can certainly, after about 5 seconds, say "You may begin."
Great. And then just one last question that came up in the past and also during the exam was about cheating, because we are not in the same environment. Sometimes you can hear someone talking on the phone about the exam and things like that. What should our examiners do if they're suspecting that the candidate is cheating?
Yeah, so this is a very tricky thing. There is definitely, because we are virtual, the potential for, I guess, unauthorized access to help is higher. And I think that if you have any suspicion, the main thing to do, like, you do not break out of role. I guess that's the one important thing. You don't break out of role and just continue to act the role of the patient and just continue the scenario. And then in your comments, after the scenario is over, in that, after that, when you've got that 12-minute period where you can mark, if you do suspect anything, unauthorized use of another phone, etc., anything, I would make note of it. If you feel that perhaps they had prior knowledge, for whatever reason, again, you would just make note of it. And I would also um, mention that to the Sue lead, so that we are aware who that candidate is. So, because sometimes we are able to track that candidate and just observe that candidate more closely, just to see whether there are any potential problems. So if there is any suspicion that the candidate is having either cheating or unauthorized help, put it in the comments and let your Sue lead know.
Wonderful. I don't think we have any more questions. So I think we can wrap it up unless, Alan, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, I think I I guess if we have no questions, we're gonna presume that, because we know most of you have examined already for the college and the virtual exam in spring, that you had a decent enough experience, and that's why you're back with us. And uh, yeah, and that you're familiar enough with the platform. Again, I do want to stress that although there are some details to do with Pratik, that we've sort of just given you broad strokes about, you will actually get a more in-depth practice of Pratik, and that's actually very, very important. Even if you've done this exam before, I strongly recommend you do that refresher again, um, for Pratik for sure. And I think that's yes. You can also email us. I think it's examinerinfo@cfpc.ca if you have any other questions at all, and we'll be very happy to try and answer them. So, I think on behalf of the college, on behalf of the project team, just thanking you. We'd like to thank you very much for agreeing to participate in this exam. This exam cannot run without the help of its committed members and examiners, leads and assistant leads. So we very, very much appreciate you taking the time and to lend us your expertise in getting this exam going. And Sam, is there anything else that we need to?
No, I think that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for
All
coming.
right. Thank you very much for coming.